What was the most progressive and hope-filled event of the last decade?
What was the most progressive and hope-filled event of the last decade? So, Ken Chandran, you strike me as an optimistic sort of chap. What was the most progressive and hope-filled event?
I think, actually, you know, the 90s was the New World Order, the establishment of the New World Order began in the 90s. You know, if there was one slogan or a couple of slogans that sums up the 90s, was New World Order and the Washington Consensus, the structural adjustment programs, the privatization, the forced privatization on the Third World. So in the last decade, I actually think the 2000s really was a historic change from the balance of forces, which from a unipolar world to what was emerging clearly now as a multipolar world. So there's several things we can identify in the last decade, which was probably, you know, very progressive and hopeful things happening, which actually were, in a way, happened because America was so caught up in Iraq that many other new emerging forces had the time to develop. And I think probably the most inspiring was what's happened in Latin America. Yeah. 7 years ago, none of us really could have imagined this incredible changes from only until very recently US-backed military dictatorships and coups against revolutionary and popular movements to now where we have indigenous presidents, you know, Morales in Bolivia, we have Chavez in Venezuela, and the whole of Latin America has changed, and no longer can America treat Latin America like its backyard. And Latin America, in alliance with the other emerging powers, led by China, but also Brazil, Iran, India, and others, I think this has been incredible change and really kind of gives us a lot of hope that we are emerging into a mutually respectful world. We've got a while to go for that, but you can see the West has to respect China. It's a bit confused about that, but it has to. It has no other alternative. And I think what we're seeing now is the US rescinding from its mad military escapades to some semblance of respect, which is slowly emerging, however problematically.
Are China and Iran progressive powers?
No, absolutely. I mean, there was an interesting opinion piece by an editor of the FT the other day about China's role in Africa, where, you know, it's obviously, you know, the ruling classes in the West are trying to convince their peers that, come on, guys, we've got to respect China because we've got no economic alternative. So for somewhere like Africa, which is probably still the region lagging most behind in the Third World, for the first time, you have to understand that Africa has an alternative trading and economic partner than that of the United States, which has devastated the continent through the 90s. And now what we have, the Beijing consensus, which has replaced the Washington consensus.
China's role in Africa.
So China's role and the emerging Third World, the BRIC countries, it actually portends to very hopeful developments and actual developments in the Third World.
China's role in Africa has been described as a colonial role, a new colonialism, like the British and the Europeans in the 19th century.
But you can read the FT editor who disagrees with that. So, you know, so there is a change of opinion emerging within mainstream discourse in the West. I would say they have no alternative, but that's it's a positive thing anyway.
Atif Ali, what positive developments do you notice?
I think the most inspirational thing for me was to see this anti-war demonstration that took place in Britain. About 1 million people were on the street. And this was an awakening call for civil society, not just Britain, but all over the world, where the first time the civilians distinguished themselves from the governments they've been ruled upon. So clearly this was a sign that people in general and masses in general cannot go together if their government took a wrong step, knowing, like, you know, a society like Britain where people are more educated, they're more aware. For third world countries there was a big sign of hope that unfortunately they never managed to stop the war, but at least that was a sign, and that was a new beginning for us. The same thing happened in Pakistan as well. Other than this war of terror, there was a huge soft revolution that happened in Pakistan, which was never mentioned in the mainstream media, where the judiciary was restored. Like, there was a mini martial law implemented by, at that time, the dictator, the Musharraf, the famous Musharraf. He put a mini martial law, and you know, all the judiciary was put behind the bars. And Pakistanis took on the streets again, and I think the inspiration came from Britain and the rest of the European civil society as well, that yes, they have the power to change the course of the history, and where they are given the right information, right power, they can demonstrate that they can come up for the right cause.
Jane Chalice, so there you go. One of your demos was one of the most hopeful events of the decade. So you're not allowed to blow your own trumpet anymore. You've already had the seal of endorsement from Atif Ali.
I would have said Latin America, because I think that is the area. But I suppose for me, and it's a tiny, tiny thing, is the very, very small number of Israeli Jews who are still fighting against the Israeli state. And there are people who, in fact, like Combatants for Peace, a group of young men and women who've been in the Israeli army, who have now come out against the operations of the Israeli army in terms of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the blockade of Gaza. And what they've been doing is trying all the time to ensure that the sort of things that Israeli soldiers are doing and have been doing is made public. And I think that the bravery of young men and women like that in a state like Israel is, for me, a huge, huge hope. They're tiny in number, but at least they are still there and still speaking out.
No, I'm sorry. Israel has always had a huge peace movement.
Sorry, it hasn't now.
Shalom,
It has not
Shalom
now.
Akshav. It has had a very large peace movement, and half of the Israeli community, of the population, has always been for peace.
No.
It's not, and it's, when you say a state like Israel, they have a Supreme Court, they have an incredibly loudmouth press. I mean, they are taking to task so many of their politicians, including Olmert, who might end up in jail, and they're a dynamic democracy. I'm sorry, when you say a state like Israel, it's not an oppressive regime.
Palestinian, as long as you're not a Palestinian in that state, and as long as you are not somebody who is there as a Palestinian under oppression because of the Israeli army.
There are 1.5 million Muslims living inside Israel, and they enjoy it, and they're not going anywhere.
They don't enjoy it.
They know.
They are at the moment being threatened.
They're a lot better off than in Gaza, where Hamas and Fatah are fighting it out. Fatah and the West Bank, where their people are being killed because of they follow Fatah.
Right.
It's a dreadful situation in Gaza.
No, the reason why people in Gaza are
left.
under oppression is because of the Israeli blockade.
They're not there anymore. They left.
Sorry, they are not permitting people in and out. We know that.
I'm not getting into Israel-Palestine here.
Right.
What are your other positive developments? I mean, one of the things I was surprised not to hear from any of you is the election of Barack Obama. Do you think that's a good thing, Carol?
I was going to say my number one is us Londoners getting rid of Ken Livingstone.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
And you were, Andrew, your wonderful, courageous journalism in the Evening Standard was one of the
Was Ken really
elements.
that bad?
I felt that a mayor of London should not become so involved in his extreme views on international politics. That's what brought him down, because he antagonized many communities, and in the end, so many people were confused about what he was there for, and so he was voted out. The people of London spoke. But my other wonderful thing over the past decade is the way women and people of color have come to the fore, that we have so many women heads of state, female heads of state. We had Condoleezza Rice in the United States, Colin Powell, and, of course, America electing a black president. And to me, that was one of the great events of the past decade. That went from Bush Jr. to Obama. That was an earthquake.
That you celebrate the rise of kind of ethnic minority in women, because that's what Ken Livingstone is famous for, is actually developing organisations and communities.
I'm talking about the United States.
But I think you know, Boris Johnson is doing Ken the biggest favour that's possible, and I think it's highly likely that Ken will be re-elected on the basis of the fiasco, which is the Boris Johnson's mayorship of London.
Calling a Jewish Chronicle reporter that he was behaving like a concentration camp guard.